Hey guys, it is that time of year again, but it is now time to begin our coverage of Survivor 44 by doing a preseason power ranking. And this was a bit tough to put together as I think there's a lot of people on this cast that I don't feel that great about and could realistically see them going either way. But then again, you could say that about pretty much every cast, but I feel like this cast was particularly hard to assess. But I'm going to be ranking all 18 players based on how likely I think they are to win the game, based on my first impressions of them, as well as their preseason interviews. And let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, the player I believe is the least likely to win the game is Danny. Now, I'll actually admit that I don't think Danny will necessarily be the first boot. And I feel like compared to other people, I actually think Danny's more likely to make a deeper run than certain other people. However, I feel like so much of his interview gave off very bad signs for me, where he talked so much about how his niece filled out his application for him and that he's terrified of playing the game. And this really screams to me as someone that doesn't really know what he's getting into. Now, yes, he is a fan and he is someone who has been watching the show for a while, so I assume he has some game knowledge. However, I feel like the fact that he's not coming into this prepared really makes me worried about how well he'll actually do. And when you add on top of that other things, like he talks a lot about compassion and kindness, which I know other people talk about, but I feel like with Danny, I really feel like that could be a sore spot for him where it could really cause him to not have much of a killer instinct, which I feel like in this modern era will be absolutely necessary for someone like Danny. And plus, something else I'll note is when I saw his cast photo, I was actually a bit surprised by how big he was physically. I feel like his original photo that was leaked by Inside Survivor definitely downplayed just how big and out front he is physically, to where I feel like he will be someone who will be leaning a lot on his physical strength. And while that will probably make him someone that will get further into the game, it's also something that makes me less confident I'll actually win the game, to where he'll either be taken out around the early merge, or he'll be someone like a Jonathan who's just dragged deeper into the game, but doesn't really have much of a shot of winning a jury vote. So really, despite thinking that Danny's going to make a deeper run than certain other people, I just don't have any confidence that he'll actually do well within the game, at least based off what we're seeing from the preseason. So because of that, he is here number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have someone who I think is a bit more likely to be an early boot than Danny, but here we have Carson, the youngest player on the cast at just 20 years old. And I feel like that alone makes me very nervous about Carson coming into it, where we have seen in recent seasons that very young players haven't done particularly well. Now, granted, they weren't necessarily early boots, like we saw Sammy doing pretty well. We obviously saw Xander got all the way to the final 3, and even Liana got to the final 7, but I don't feel like Carson is necessarily built like those other people. And I feel like he is someone who definitely fits this archetype of being like a Christian style figure, or possibly even a JD, given that he comes off as an overachiever. And I worry that Carson will probably be left out on a lot of the early alliances that could lead to him being a relatively early boot. But I feel like even if he were to make a deeper run beyond that, I just don't really see him having what it takes to make it all the way to the very end. And I feel like he is someone who may not even have respect to win a jury vote given just how young he is. And yes, while this is a bit of a younger cast, I feel like the fact that he is so young and the fact that he is still in school makes me a bit worried about how well he'll actually do within the game. That mixing in with his early boot potential, I can't really have him any higher than number 17 here. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we actually have someone who I really like personally, and I feel like this person will be my rooting interest coming into the season. But I feel like as a player, I'm not getting the best sense about their overall potential within the game. But here we have KANE. And I like KANE a lot. He definitely reminds me of these Jacob Derwin and Daniel Strunk types. And that's an archetype that I naturally gravitate towards. And I'll be very interested to see how he does within this season. And even beyond that, I did like a lot of his interview answers where he talks about wanting to be this Tyson-like character with having this dry humor. And I feel like he could, in some situations, build social bonds. However, I also feel like his tribe is not the best for him. I feel like he may have trouble building bonds right off the bat. And plus, he does come off as a bit sketchy at points to where I could definitely see him being an early target. And even if he were to make it deeper into the game, I also feel like that target would preclude him to where I'm not entirely sure he'll be able to maintain a strong position even if he were to get it for too much of the game compared to certain other people, and it's that hesitation that makes me want to put him a bit lower on the list. But granted, I feel like he has a bit more potential to do well within the game, plus he has plenty of game experience and obviously life experience that makes me a bit more confident in him compared to Danny or Carson, but realistically I can't have him too much higher than 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and I actually debated these next two as I feel like these next two players sort of have opposite problems. However, I feel like this next player probably has less upside compared to this next person, even though it's sort of against my intuition. But here we have MADDY, and I think MADDY is someone who definitely has some upside. I don't think she's entirely lacking in terms of potential, as she comes off as someone that very much is going to be playing hard. She talked about playing a big game, and she is a pretty big fan of the show. However, she also comes off as pretty impulsive, to where she does talk about playing a big game. She talks about looking for advantages a lot. She even admits herself in the interview that she can be a bit short-sighted at points, which is a bit of a point there for self-awareness. However, it's still something that I think will be an issue for her within the game, sort of developing a more long-term strategy. And she very much screams out to me as someone who will play too hard too fast. Now, again, it's not a guarantee that that will happen, which is why I do have her a bit higher on the list, but I still feel like she has a lot of potential to be an early boot given how hard she's going to be playing. And plus, I'm not entirely sure how well she's going to connect with the rest of her tribe. That makes me a bit more worried about her coming into it, but it's the fact that she's at least going to be playing hard that makes me a bit more confident in her compared to these other people. That does leave her here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have another player that I definitely have issues with, although I feel like there are slightly different issues than with MADDY. But here we have Lauren. And I know there are people who are actually pretty high on Lauren and seem to like her quite a bit. However, I'm not quite on that bandwagon. I feel like for her, she has two pretty major red flags that keep me from putting her higher on the list. One is the fact that she is a more recent fan. She talks about in her interview how she calls herself a new era super fan and hasn't really been familiarizing herself with the older seasons. Now, granted, it's not so much a flaw that she hasn't watched every single season, but it does make me think that she doesn't have as much game knowledge as a lot of other players on the cast. But I think the bigger red flag is the fact that she talks a lot in her interview about how she recently went through a divorce and that she's basically seeing this as an experience for personal growth, which good on her. I mean, people come on this show for different reasons. However, if we are assessing her based on how she'll play the game, it doesn't give me the best signs. And at first I thought that this would simply be her not really having her head in the game, but after reading her interview, she definitely seems pretty eager to be looking for advantages, and she seems to want to play a big game, which coupled with her lack of game knowledge, I do worry that it could lead to her making moves just for the sake of making moves or just to prove herself, which I mean, could lead to success, but I feel like it's more than likely going to lead to her making pretty bad moves within the game and could lead to her playing too hard too fast. Now, with all that said, I do have her above MADDY, mainly because I feel like she's more likely to get in the majority alliance early on compared to MADDY, to where I feel like she's less likely to be an early boot unless she severely overplays. But it's the fact that she isn't as knowledgeable with the game, and plus her being here for the experience, it doesn't give me too much confidence coming into it. So because of that, I do have her here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and I didn't know what to do with this person, and I feel like through that they just ended up landing here. But here we have Matt from San Francisco, and I have no idea what Matt is going to be doing within the game. And I didn't exactly get the best vibe from his interview, where he talked a lot about failing at things, like applying for jobs and failing and stuff like that. And it makes me think that he's probably going to try a lot of things within the game, seemingly not worried about whether he's going to fail. And it could lead to him working out, or it could lead to him making a ton of mistakes. Now, obviously, the immediate comparison is with Owen from 43, where it seemed like everything went wrong for him on that season, which makes me think that Matt could be in a somewhat similar position. And if I'm being honest, I have no idea how he's ultimately going to do on the season, where I could very easily see him being an early boot. I could also see him being like an early merge boot. I could also see him being dragged to the end as a GOAT. And admittedly, I don't think it's as likely that he could win based on what I've gotten from him so far. Although, considering the rest of the cast, I mean, it's not impossible, I guess. But I feel like there's enough question marks with how he's going to do. Plus, the stuff that I did get wasn't stuff that I was super thrilled about. That leaves him here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12. And this is another player that I think could go either way. Although I think I have a better idea of the possibilities for this person. But here we have Bruce. And Bruce is an interesting figure where he definitely gives off some mixed signals where on one hand, like hearing him talk and stuff, he seems like a pretty cool, calm and collected guy, someone who's not going to be super erratic. But then there are other weird comments that sort of contradict that, like he says that he identifies with Coach as his non-winner, which is kind of out of left field. He also thinks that people will perceive him as arrogant, which, okay. And honestly, it's sort of a weird situation where I think he'll be like wise enough within the game to not be domineering per se, but he's also someone that I could easily see fitting in that role. And I think he's someone who could either be like a very early boot due to him not clicking with his tribe, or it could be someone who emerges pretty out in front, maybe as a figurehead for his alliance, but then is eventually taken out because of that. I think Bruce to win the game would need to be a bit different from how I saw him in his interview, which to be fair is possible. I mean, he has a lot of life experience. He's also the oldest player on the cast, which considering that he's only 46 does sort of speak to how this is a bit of a younger cast. But I think based on what I'm seeing from him, I think it could go either one of two ways, where he is that early boot, or someone that gets a bit further in the game but is eventually sniped out for being too far out in front. But it's a mixture of these things that leave him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have another player that I think could go either way, where I actually think this person is a bit more likely to be an early boot than someone like a Bruce, but I think there's also a higher upside for this person. But here we have JAIME Lynn, who I believe is simply going by Jaime based on her interview. And I don't know what to think of JAIME Lynn, where she does seem like a super fan. She is a bit on the younger side, and I could see her connecting with a certain group of people, although there are certain things I could see that could lead to her being an early target. I mean, for one, I could see her easily being someone who could be seen as a bit expendable. And you also have her whole plan of building this 4-person alliance, which, could come to fruition. But even then, I don't think it's necessarily something that's going to work out how she expects it to. Where she says that she wants to look for someone who's sneaky, who will just feed her information, which I don't think she'll be able to get that particular person. So I think that's a bit of an unrealistic expectation there. But even outside of that, I think she is someone who could very easily just be seen as pretty expendable and be cut because of that. So that gives me a bit of worry, but I feel like compared to people like a Bruce, I think there is more upside for her if she were to find her group and be a part of the majority alliance. So I think that it's that upside that leaves her above these other people, but it's still that downside that leaves her here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have another pretty high variance player, but here we have Heidi. And I think Heidi is another player that could go either way, where on one hand, she is one of the older players on the cast. She is a bit on the smaller side physically, to where I could easily see her being an early boot because of that. But I also think there's plenty of upside as well, where if she's able to get within the majority alliance, then she could make a deep run. And I think there is a chance that she could fly under the radar, to where she could easily sneak her way through the game without being seen as this big threat. I actually think an interesting comparison is with Carla from last season, which is another person I had similar concerns with. Now, mind you, I said at the time that Carla is probably going to end up in the majority alliance. I don't think it's as guaranteed to happen with Heidi. I could still see Heidi being targeted due to her perceived physical weakness. However, if she's able to crack through, I think Heidi definitely has a lot of potential to get towards the end of the game without being seen as this massive threat. And I think she is someone who could have an interesting story there. So I think Heidi actually has quite a bit of potential within the game, but it's that massive, massive worry spot at the very beginning of the game that leaves her a bit lower on this list. So because of that, I have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have another pretty high variance player. But here we have Frannie. And again, I think Frannie is definitely a high variance player. She seems a bit quirky and through that I could see her like not quite fitting in right off the bat, and if she ends up going the tribal early on, I could definitely see that being an issue for her. However, I still think there's plenty of upside for her to get within her majority alliance and through that make a deep run. And compared to other people like Heidi, I actually think it's more likely that Frannie slips through those early rounds and is able to find her people and make a deep run because of that. Now, if I'm being honest, I mean, if we were comparing her to like other people within her archetype, you definitely have people like Helen from Ghost Island. You even have Aubrey from Korong, of course, who are all players that played pretty competent games and made deep runs, but didn't necessarily come into the endgame in the best position to actually win it. And I do worry a bit that Frannie could fall into that trap towards the end of the game. I would be very interested to see how she tries to counter those perceptions. But it's that upside of her at least getting through those early rounds that puts her above a lot of these other pretty high variance players. So because of that, I have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we definitely have two of the bigger characters on the season going back to back, and definitely two of the preseason favorites. But at number 8, I did decide to go with Carolyn. And I'm sure some people will say that Carolyn is too high on this list, as she definitely gives off this Nora energy. And obviously Nora wasn't exactly the best player in the world. But the main thing I will say about Carolyn is she does have a decent amount of self-awareness to her. She recognizes that she's this quirky character. She recognizes that she's probably not going to be on everyone's winner picks. But she is also a massive super fan. Like, she was involved in the Survivor Org community, so she is definitely someone who I think understands the game, and she is someone who will definitely understand her perception coming into it. And I know people say that she'll be an early boot. I'm not necessarily on that train. I think she's someone who may end up on the outs early on, but will ultimately find her people and will ultimately skate by through those early rounds because of that. Now, yes, there's still some early boot potential, especially if she just flames out right at the beginning, but I think more than likely she's able to find her footing in the game and make a deep run because of that. Now, if I'm being honest, I think Carolyn could also run into perception issues later on in the game, to where people could see her as being pretty emotional and through that not really see her game as being that strategic. But again, it's the fact that she is a super fan that gives me a bit more confidence in her. So I think I am a bit higher on Carolyn coming into it than I probably expected, and I'm sure higher than certain other people expected. But it's still those downsides that I will admit are there that leave her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we probably have the fan favorite coming into the season based on what I've seen. But here we have Jam Jam, and obviously there's a lot to say about Jam Jam as a character. He seems like a very fun presence, definitely someone who's going to bring a lot of entertainment to the season and a lot of positive energy to the season as well. And I also think he's someone who will definitely connect well with a lot of people early on, and coupling that with him being a super fan, and I think he is someone who definitely will probably make the merge unless he's seen as that big of a threat. However, I feel like the main reason I can't have him too much higher than there is because I feel like he will eventually become such a massive threat later on in the game, where he is so likable and he is so out in front that I will find it hard to see how he is able to fly under the radar for too long before people take him out later on in the game. But I feel like he has more win equity if he was able to make a deep run compared to someone like a Carolyn. That leaves him a bit higher on the list for me. But it's the fact that I think he'll be targeted more towards the end game that leaves him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and admittedly, I wasn't a huge fan of this person's interview, but I still think they have some upside. But here we have Josh, and Josh is a bit weird because his interview doesn't exactly give me the most confidence in the world. He talks a lot about his physical ability, which was actually a concern for me when I first read his bio and hearing about his medical history, where despite him coming off as this pretty jacked guy, that I was worried that the fact that he's on medication would be a hindrance for him. But it seems like now it's not as big of a concern, and actually he talks so much about his physical ability to where I worry that it's going to get pretty out in front, and I think he's going to struggle a lot with threat management. And plus, there is also concern that he could rub some people off the wrong way, that he could potentially play too hard too fast, and through that he could be like an unnecessarily large threat because of that. However, I still think there's enough potential with him where he is pretty good physically, and I assume that he's familiar enough with the show to where he'll be good enough strategically. So while there are definitely question marks, I am willing to give Josh the benefit of the doubt, despite the concerns that I have for him coming into it. But it is those red flags that leave him here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have someone who I definitely feel pretty good about coming into it, although there are still some concerns that I have for their actual chances. But here we have Brandon, and the obvious comparison here is with Danny from Survivor 41, where both of them were NFL players, both of them seem to be one of the more physical guys on the cast. And admittedly, I remember not feeling too high on Danny at the time of the preseason, given how little he seemed to talk about the actual game. However, he did prove me wrong, and he actually ended up being a pretty capable player, only being taken out the final 6 due to him being a social threat rather than a physical threat. And I think Brandon is approaching this game from a similar mindset, where despite him being one of the more physical guys out there, that he's going to try to downplay that and really lean into these more social elements. He said that he models his game after Danny and Jeremy Collins, and as using this meat shield strategy. Now, admittedly, I'm not entirely sure how effective that's going to be, as despite there being some shields that he could turn to, I still worry that he could be a bit too out in front by the end of it, as we even saw with Danny by the end of Survivor 41. But I still feel like Brandon is definitely going into the game with the right mindset, and I think he'll be pretty capable, and I think he has a lot of upside with him. So because of that, I do have him here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and I really like this player, and I think they have a lot of potential coming into it. However, I still worry about their prospects in the short term, but here we have Helen. Now, realistically, compared to all the other high variance players we talked about earlier, I'm not as worried about Helen falling under the radar or being flat out on the outs. I think she will actually be pretty good socially early on, as she talks a lot in her interview about adapting to different groups and really being able to connect well with different people, mixing that in with her being a super fan, and I think she has a lot of potential coming into it. I'm more so worried about her potentially getting sniped out of the game early due to her being seen as this under the radar threat, as obviously these players have seen both 41 and 42, and they've seen 2 seasons in a row that have had under the radar players, at least from a gameplay perspective. So I can imagine that someone like an Helen might have a tougher time getting through the game playing that style of game, to where people will probably be more on the lookout for people like that coming into it. But I feel like if she's able to get past that, I think there's still a lot of potential for Helen to do well, and I think she'll be able to navigate the game pretty effectively. So it's that upside that makes her this high on the list, but it's the downside of her potentially getting sniped down the pre-merge that leaves her here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and I'm sure some people will have this person a bit lower on the list, and I still have some hesitation with this person. However, I still think there's a lot of upside there, but here we have Sarah. And I like Sarah as well. She comes off as a pretty well-rounded player, pretty good physically, pretty good strategically. Socially is where I have a bit more question marks. I'm not exactly sure how well she's going to click with her respective tribe, where I could easily see her coming off as pretty cold and making her more like a Tory figure from 42, and through that she could potentially be an early boot because of that. However, I think if she's able to find her footing socially, I think she could be a very dangerous player. Now, the main reason I have her above Helen is I think she's less likely to be seen as his under-the-radar threat. I assume that Sarah's going to be playing this relatively aggressive game where she is going to be a bit more out in front. Now, within that comes some risk of her being too out in front to where she is eventually taken out for being like a big threat or for overplaying. So there's still some concerns that I have coming into it. But I feel like compared to a lot of other players we talked about that I also have concerns about, I feel like there's enough upside with Sarah to where I can at least have her this on the list, although I can very easily see her tumbling back down. But for now, I did decide to have her here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and I did debate these next 2, as I feel like these 2 are people that I feel pretty good about coming into the season. Now granted, we've had this before where the player that has the most perfect preseason interviews is not always necessarily going to do well within the game, but considering that's all that I have to go off of, I am left to assess these 2 accordingly. But at number 2, I did decide to go with Claire, and Claire has a lot of things going for her. She is a pretty big super fan of the show, and I think she'll play pretty well for the most part. And I feel like compared to a lot of these other fans of the show, these younger women, I think Claire is less likely to be taken up pre-merge than a lot of those other people. I think she's going to be able to connect well with a decent chunk of the cast, as well as navigate her position to ensure that she isn't sniped out of the game or seen as this big of a threat. Now, with that said, I still have some question marks about how well she'll actually do as we get more towards the end game, and I think ultimately I'm going more off my gut feeling based on how I reacted to these interviews compared to anything else. But with that said, I still think Claire is going to do pretty well, but she just missed out on being my winner pick, and because of that, she is here at number 2. And now, at number 1, my winner pick going into Survivor 44 is Matthew from Ohio. And admittedly, Matthew isn't perfect either. Like, sort of similar to Danny, he gives off these answers that sort of say that he has a bit more of a soft side in the game. Like, he talks a lot about compassion, to where I do worry that he might lack a killer instinct. And through that, I could see him not making optimal moves. I could see him ending up in a situation like Cody from 43, where it's due to him being blindly loyal to people or not being able to make moves on his own that could lead to his downfall. But I still really like Matthew. I mean, he is another character sort of similar to Jam that I think is going to click with his tribe very well. Despite him being one of the older players on the cast, I think he's going to connect very well with a decent chunk of the players, but not be the biggest threat on the board. Now, granted, if the other big threats like Brandon or Jam are eventually taken out, then I could see that being a problem for him in the end game. But I still get the best sense of Matthew's game from his interviews, which again could lead to his downfall down the road, where he could be this relatively perfect candidate on paper, but not actually play the best game in the world. But even then, like, I still think there's enough upside with him. Like, he is a super fan. He is someone who I think will be pretty good socially and probably physically, to where I think I had the most faith in him coming into this season. Now, again, we'll have to see what happens once the season actually starts. But with all the information that I currently have, Matthew is my winner pick. And because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, once the season actually starts, I'll be doing weekly power rankings for it, so stay tuned for that. I am currently covering Australian Survivor as well, and I believe Big Brother Canada will be starting just a week after 44 starts, so you can expect coverage for that as well. There's really a lot of stuff going on. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, and I'm actually doing a draft game for 44, so if you want to play, be sure to join. But there's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.